Few moments illustrate the dual perception of Richard III as strikingly as the events at Stony Stratford on April 30th, 1483, when the young Edward V and his uncle, the future Richard III, came face to face. According to Dominic Mancini, the young king had just realized that despite all his uncle's oaths, he was essentially a prisoner. Yet Richard, his uncle, saw things entirely differently. His own writings reveal that he believed he was saving both his nephew and the kingdom. Both perspectives have merit, and both are flawed. To this day, historians find it difficult to separate themselves from these deeply entrenched interpretations. Yet these perspectives offer significant insights into Richard, still Duke of Gloucester at the time. Let's begin with the Richard hostile view of the Stony Stratford incident. The Privy Council had already appointed Edward V as king and had agreed that he should govern as an adult from the outset. The king was to be advised by a single council, with Richard as chairman. However, this role granted Richard no real authority over the Crown's government. Despite this, Richard had just ordered the arrest of Edward's closest confidants, his maternal uncle Anthony, Earl Rivers, who had acted like a father to him, his half-brother Richard Grey, and his chamberlain Sir Thomas Vaughan. All three were sent north. In essence, this was nothing short of a kidnapping. Worse still, Edward V did not agree with the actions. By the council's decision, Edward was already a fully competent adult king, and Richard, despite having recognized Edward's sovereignty several times, disregarded his wishes. Regardless of subsequent events at this moment, Richard's actions amounted to high treason. Even 12-year-old Edward could see that his royal authority was being undermined. There was no undoing what had occurred. Speculating on what might have happened to Richard if Edward had been crowned is futile. Everyone involved understood that an irrevocable act had taken place. Now let's consider Richard's point of view. He believed a coup d'etat had already taken place, orchestrated by the Queen's family, the Woodvilles. Richard, with his ally Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, brought this charge to light at Stony Stratford. To this day, Ricardians maintain that Richard was justified, and they are correct, though they often fail to explain it convincingly. They rely too heavily on Richard's own words. Just 4 days later, Richard and Buckingham paraded wagons filled with Woodville weapons through the streets of London. Edward V had previously been guarded by a 2,000-men strong force, largely made up of Woodville troops. These forces were disarmed, and the weapons from the wagons left little doubt about where they had come from. Even if we discount the idea that anyone truly wanted Richard dead, this spectacle was far more vivid than any constitutional concerns Richard had raised, particularly for a 12-year-old. Technically, Richard's use of the word conspiracy may have been inaccurate. Everything the Woodvilles did occurred openly. Before his death, Edward IV had named Richard as Lord Protector to govern on behalf of his nephew until he came of age. The Woodvilles, however, ignored this dying wish in the Privy Council, securing a majority in Richard's absence. When it was suggested that the king's uncle should be consulted, Thomas Grey, Edward V's half-brother, reportedly remarked that the council was important enough to make decisions without Richard. The Woodvilles clearly intended not only to disregard Edward IV's last wish, but to seize total control. Key to their plan was Earl Rivers, the young king's closest advisor. It was generally assumed Edward would follow whatever guidance Rivers and his mother, the Queen, provided. Richard's dilemma was thus: the Woodvilles had dismissed Edward IV's final orders, controlled the king, and marginalized Richard's role as a council member. Thomas Grey held the powerful post of Constable of the Tower of London, and Elizabeth Woodville's brother, Sir Edward, had been made Admiral of the Fleet, giving them control over part of the army as well. From Richard's perspective, The Woodvilles were acting so quickly that they did not even wait for the young king's approval, though they had declared him a fully capable monarch. They made decisions that the council, as constituted, no longer had the authority to make. While there was a strong likelihood that Edward would retroactively approve their actions, the Woodvilles had overstepped, and this too was treason. Richard, one of the victims of this betrayal, was now defending himself. Both sides were aware of the other's perspective. Richard knew that if Edward remained in contact with the Woodvilles, he would be blamed for the events at Stony Stratford. The Woodvilles, for their part, understood that they had repeatedly overstepped their authority. Once they no longer had the king's protection, they had no choice but to flee. Elizabeth Woodville, her family, and Thomas Grey sought sanctuary at Westminster not out of fear of Richard, but out of fear of their own actions. This episode reveals much about Richard's character. Whether or not one agrees with his judgment, Richard had a clear sense of right and wrong, and did not shy away from personal risk. It must have been obvious to him that his actions at Stony Stratford could have serious consequences. His letters to the north, requesting troops, confirm this. Though Ricardians may prefer to forget it, Thomas Vaughan died simply because he was a confidant of Edward V. Richard was deeply convinced of his importance and believed his life was in danger. He saw himself as the one who must save the kingdom from the looming threat. Reconciliation with the Woodvilles seemed impossible to him. In fact, the council would later request that he be more respectful toward Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Dowager. Scholars have long debated whether Richard acted or reacted in the weeks leading up to his claim to the throne. However, the real issue is how Richard's self-image influenced his decisions. The man who stood before Edward V on April 30th, 1483, was a product of his time, shaped largely by his relationship with Edward IV. This is part of a larger video to be released in a few weeks. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe to Stay Tuned for the full documentary.